So you notice I don't wear the headset right now because it now belongs to Gwen for a little while. And so she's had this most incredible opportunity to serve the Lord in a distant place, and she has prepared a talk to share with us now. Would you give her a big welcome as she wears the headset and will share with us.
Hello, everybody, and good morning. And thank you, Pastor Jim, for giving me the time and the opportunity to tell this story. Being up here is actually a little bit like walking on water again, because this is not a normal role that I play. So anyhow, it's outside my comfort zone. But I do have a story to tell, and I hope that it will bring encouragement to all of you. I got to Africa because of a 1912 Singer Treadle sewing machine. And it was an inheritance from my aunt and uncle, and I couldn't find a place for it in our home. The wood was damaged from having been a plant stand for many years, and it needed some work. So it sat in our garage for a couple of years, but I actually wasn't very content just to store it. And I thought it was too precious to take to the metal recyclers, so I searched for someone to give it to. And after a bit of searching, I didn't know it, but God's hand was already at work. And I went to an antique store in Fort Langley and was told that there was a group of people that would refurbish this machine and send it to Africa. To a part of Africa where there was no electricity, to a part of Africa where that sewing machine could be the part of a family business. It seemed like an answer to prayer to me, a perfect future for the sewing machine. So I took the phone number, and that's how I met Marge Rattel and Corley Boo Neuroscience Foundation. Paul and I got the sewing machine into the car, and we took it over to their warehouse. Well, calling it a warehouse is actually being quite polite, because this is a converted chicken barn. It's about 300 feet long, where Corley Boo assembles and puts together used medical equipment, which is then loaded up into containers to ship to West Africa every 6 weeks or so. We could hardly believe our eyes to see the array of sometimes really expensive equipment, sometimes ordinary used medical equipment, everything from x-ray machines, incubators, surgical tubing, microscopes, hospital beds, mattresses, everything imaginable that went in these containers. And they're all tightly packed with towels and sheets and children's stuffies and baby clothes. Everything is packed with love and compassion. And at Corley Boo, this is called heart power. As we realized what we were seeing in front of us, Marge said, "You know, this isn't a random meeting, but this is a divine appointment. You should come to Africa." Over the next few months, we went regularly through the barn to help pack containers destined for West Africa. And we learned the intricacy of loading a container really tightly packed with sheets and towels and stuffies and gift boxes for babies and for moms. Sometimes these are the only gifts that child will ever have, so that none of the expensive equipment would shift in transit. And this is an incubator that had a special crate made for it before it got crated up into the container. It's for babies, and it's just been packed. And we always pack so that the first thing that people see when they open those containers is love and compassion. And stuffies seem to have that way of making people feel like they are loved. So we always put stuffies. That's the very first thing that people see when those containers are opened. And as the containers are being packed in BC, we are praying for the unknown recipients. And we're praying blessings and praise and joy over all of those things. Well, in the middle of this packing, Marge said again, "You should come to Africa with us. We need a gardener for a hospital project, and we need a photographer." Well, the actual call to go to Africa came when I was in Kelowna. I was looking after grandkids, and the email said, "Leaving in 13 days." Our daughter-in-law, Amanda, said, "You should go," and I prayed about it all the way home on the bus the next day. And God kept saying, "Yes," and I kept asking, "Why me?" And he said, "Just go." He kept saying, "Just go." And so finally I said, "Yes, I'll go." Well, tickets were purchased, and Marge spoke about how this would be a walking on water experience, trusting Jesus every step of the way, and having the faith to believe that if God wanted me to go to Liberia, He would take care of the details. I started thinking about Jesus walking on the water, the terror of the disciples, not knowing who they were seeing coming through towards them, and then the comforting words from Jesus. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Come. And then Peter said, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come in the water. And Jesus did say, come. Paul and I were already committed to a conference in North Carolina the next week. Wouldn't you know it, our flight home was canceled by one day because of a big storm. More patients walking on water. Once home, I needed to get a Liberian visa, but the closest embassy is actually in Washington, D.C. Well, my passport and application were sent off, only 5 days left before we were leaving for Africa. It could have been a nail-biting situation, but I was confident that God was in control. And if he really wanted me to go to Africa, my visa and my passport would arrive home in time. It did, with half a day to spare. Then there were the travel shots. Babette, you would know this. I didn't know they were supposed to be booked a month ahead of time. I didn't have a month to book them ahead of time. So there were a lot of phone calls around to a lot of different clinics, and I was starting to feel, well, maybe God doesn't want me to go to Africa, because this is starting to be really difficult getting these shots. And then out of the blue, one clinic phoned back to say that they would open up an emergency clinic just for me. So the next day, I received yellow fever, tetanus, typhoid, and a whole bunch of booster shots. Wow. Now I knew I could really pack my bags. I was really walking on water, and God was taking me to Africa. So we left Vancouver, went to Montreal, Brussels, Freetown, and then Monrovia, and ultimately to Tapeda. And you can see all of those right in there. So it's a small country. Monrovia is the capital. Tapeda is a little town way out in the interior in the jungle. Our arrival in Monrovia started with a series of meetings with government officials and special organizations. Corley Boo seeks to build, with integrity, stable and effective relationships throughout West Africa, which enables equipment and resources to get where they are needed. Corley Boo refuses to pay bribes or to ship through ports where there are exorbitant fees. So as we arrived at the Ministry of Health for a special commissioning ceremony, we saw one of our containers. It had been recently sent and had arrived here in Monrovia. And to me, it was a really great sight because I knew I had put some of those pieces of equipment in that container, and here it was sitting and being unpacked. Well, this is the Canadian team that came together. I think there were 7 of us, and Dr. Francis Ketta is standing beside me. And he is the Deputy Health Minister in Liberia. And he has a very long relationship with Corley Boo. I had already met him when he visited Langley last fall, and Paul spent an entire day with him at the barn, helping him identify items that would be useful for his work in Liberia. He was really excited to be able to put Liberia on so much equipment, but including this autoclave, because they did not have one in his hospital in Monrovia. Well, Francis is U.S. educated. He's a surgeon. He was born under a tree because his mom did not have access to medical help. He expresses much gratitude that they both survived because the maternal mortality rate is 1 in 6, especially in those remote villages. He is a man of great faith and of great vision, and he has an enormous compassion for his countrymen. He serves with commitment and passion and endless energy to bring health care to Liberians, especially that maternity care. He too walks on water daily as he tackles the enormity of helping his country overcome the poverty and destitution left by years of civil war and Ebola. And so our first official event was commissioning this ambulance, which came ultimately from Langley and Surrey. But it was found in Quebec. It was brought to Kamloops. There's a group of guys up there, they're firemen, and they refurbished it. They brought it up to absolute BC standards and put all the equipment and all of the medical things in it that was needed, and it was sent off to Liberia. And David, the man in charge of all that repair, is this fella here. He's a fireman in Kamloops. And along with the ambulance, they packed up a whole bunch of EMS jackets. These guys were thrilled because they had never had jackets before. And 180 fireman suits donated from Lower Mainland fire departments. And later that day, we spotted these firemen. They were coming down the highway on the top of the fire truck with all this gear piled around them, and they were hooping and hollering for joy because they had never had firefighting clothes before. So they thought that this was the most special gift that could have come from anywhere. Well, all the dignitaries were here at this event, and so was the press. I believe we were on TV. Later that day, we had audiences. This is the health minister of Liberia. So we had an audience with her. We went to the finance minister and had tea with him. We went to the mayor of Monrovia and had a visit with him as well. And we went to 2 hospitals and had audiences with their administrators as well. And Corley Boo regularly goes into hospitals. We teach people at the hospitals so that nurses and medical teams know how to move injured people. In Liberia, typically people are thrown on the back of a motorbike and hauled through the jungle for 3 hours to get medical help. By that point, there isn't much hope for that patient. So they're always teaching how to properly move people and how to try and get them to help that they need in a reasonable manner. And heart power is taught. Heart power really, just in a few words, means giving medical care with compassion and love, and treating people with compassion and love. And so this is kind of a theme that goes throughout everything that we were doing. Well, the next day was actually more fun because we went to Elwa. Elwa means eternal love, winning Africans. It's a compound which houses several missionary societies, including West Africa's Samaritan Purse. And we met Joni, who is the chief administrator there. And among other projects, she is a person responsible for storing all the shoe boxes that come to West Africa in those containers until they are sent out to kids all over West Africa. And she's a wonderful lady. She's given up a lot. Her family misses her. She comes from, I think it's Iowa or somewhere in the middle of the U.S. Anyhow, we had a wonderful visit with her. And then we met Emile and Margaret from Mission Aviation Fellowship. And these are people who fly goods to remote areas of West Africa so that those living in isolated places can experience the love of Jesus Christ. And it was in their Cessna that we actually flew up to Tapeta in. And again, very lovely and warm people. Margaret was out in her backyard feeding her chickens when we were there. And so I just thought I would show you a personal picture. Then we met David and Nancy Wrightball from SIM. So this is the same mission that Jason and Shannon Brink are serving with in, where are they? In Malawi, I think it is. And Nancy is a nurse. And she's actually quite famous. She was on the cover of Time magazine at one point because she's one of the very few people that survived the Ebola crisis after becoming very, very ill with that disease. And this was at the height of the crisis, before they actually understood the disease and how it was being spread and what kind of care was needed to defeat this disease. And she was sent to the U.S. for treatment. It was very controversial that Ebola person was brought to the U.S. Anyhow, she survived it, and she's back in Africa where she's serving, and serving with a lot of love and a lot of compassion. And that is how she answered that call to walk on water with her faith. She's sitting beside Dr. James Galway, and he's actually the head of Elwa Hospital, and he's also a pastor. And I'm going to show you the mission statement of that hospital. I'm not sure if you can read it, but the very bottom lines are portraying Christian ethics and Christ-like compassion and integrity. And wouldn't it be nice, I kept thinking, if our hospitals actually had a vision statement like that at the front door when you came into them. And I thought that was really neat. But what was even neater is this. Every nursing station has colorfully painted Bible verses on the walls as good reminders of that Christ-like compassion. And every single nursing station in that hospital had these. This one actually came from the emergency station. And I thought it was quite interesting because be joyful, patient in affliction, in hope, faithful in prayer. And the emergency entrance that day was a state of chaos. There were people who were under great stress, great medical needs were happening. I think somebody had died. And Africans don't hold anything back. They have loud voices. So it was quite a ruckus going on there. And I spotted those voices and I thought, I wonder if anybody's actually reading them today. But anyhow, this is the hospital where Nancy had worked endlessly caring for her Ebola patients. But thanks to a really generous donation, a healing garden has been established in this hospital grounds, and it's there to honor all of the lives that were lost to Ebola at that time. And I believe it was something like 600 people, so it's a huge number of people. Now there is no Ebola in Liberia. People always ask me that. Liberians are very concerned about sanitation and about keeping their hands clean, and they know how to fight the disease. There is a Canadian vaccination now that came out of Winnipeg that is actually very effective. It's difficult to vaccinate people in jungles, so it's difficult to find all the people that need these vaccinations. But anyhow, they have a really good handle on that Ebola. Well, this was a really wonderful and fulfilling day that we had, and in response, our team held a gratitude dinner to honor all of these new friends that we had made and to celebrate our common goals of bringing love and compassion to the people of West Africa. And so we had made a whole lot of new friends that day, and we're still keeping in touch and still cooperating and working together. Well, Monrovia is a city, and it's full of people. And it's full of movement, taxis and cars and motorbikes and people trying to cross streets. This is a Saturday night, by the way. 9 o'clock on Monday morning, it's almost impassable to get through these streets. So there are a lot of taxis and a lot of constant motion on the streets, people just running across them. We didn't ever have to walk across the street, and I was very thankful for that because I don't think I would have wanted to try to get through there. And there are street vendors everywhere. And they occupy every nook and cranny. They sell everything from all of their food, fruits and vegetables. The fruit stands are always amazing. They're so artistically put together. And then sometimes they're just selling household goods. You can see how narrow the strip of land between the highway and that wall is where they have to work from. And sometimes it's fabrics and blankets and just odds and ends of anything under the sun appear on these little booths. Very seldom did we ever see a store that you could actually walk into to get anything. They did have a grocery store that we went to, but most people shop this way. Well, the city sits along the Atlantic Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean is absolutely stunning and beautiful. What you don't see there are resorts. There are no resorts. I think there might be one that's starting to be built, but there is a great lack of resorts. People don't come to Liberia for holidays. They don't come there to enjoy anything about Liberia because it's a pretty war-torn nation. But you can see how beautiful the beaches are. The only problem is that there's a lot of garbage everywhere. And this garbage is right up along the beaches. There's goats everywhere as well. And then the raw sewage just runs right into the ocean. During the 14 years of civil war, much of the infrastructure was destroyed, and there hasn't been enough resources in that country to repair the sewer lines and the water lines. So people now get their water from community wells. And these are just along the roads in random places, it seems to me. And often there'll be vendors right there. And you can see there's some furniture right there, some leather couches actually that were for sale. And this is how business is done in Liberia. Every morning these wells get really busy as families come. They have big 5-gallon buckets. They fill them up with water and then they put them on their heads and take them back to wherever their home might be. So it's a lot of work for them to get their water. And there are buildings everywhere, like this one. They're just hollow shells with shards of glass. If you look, I don't think you can see it, but all along here, there's just broken glass that's been concreted in there to keep people out. And you can see the barbed wire and more barbed wire and more barbed wire. So that's what the typical streets look like, a lot of barbed wire. We don't know what they're protecting, probably somebody's home or something behind those walls. Well, signage is really fascinating, and it walks two worlds. There are many references to God. I'm not sure how effective they are, but this is the God is Able Business Center. Doesn't look like a business center that we would go to. However, that's what its name was. And then we found the Faith and Joy Bar and Restaurant. So we're snapping these pictures as we're driving in vehicles along the highway or along the streets. Well, then this one just fascinated me, the Lucky Pharmacy for life-saving drugs. And this one was actually, I found this in a hospital lobby, and I thought, this is too funny, I have to take a picture of that one. And we did eventually find the little drugstore with the same item on it. And then there was a dress stall. Us ladies were quite fascinated with this because it was called, I can't remember the name. And usually there were dresses hanging where that green part of the wall is there. And then there was a cell phone company called 99 Missed Calls. So I don't know if this is where you would like to go and buy your next cell phone, but this is what happens in Liberia. And then there were taxis with reassuring names like God's Grace. And we wondered, would this be the more safe one to drive in? Because they do get into a lot of accidents. They've only got 3 tires on them. And anyhow, these were just a sampling of the really, what we thought were unusual signs. I think for the first day, all we wanted to do was take pictures of signs because it was quite the culture shock for us. Well, I was very excited to get to Tapeta. And getting there was its own excitement. Even though it's a town with, and the flight stayed in the country, we went on a Cessna, but we had our passports were checked and our immunization records were checked. Our temperatures were taken. This is a remnant from Ebola days. Our luggage was searched, don't know why. And of course, everything had to be weighed, including us, before we could get on that plane. And eventually we did get on, and that's the plane that we flew in. But flying over the land opened my eyes to another side of Liberia. The beautiful farmed garden plots were right along the ocean, where in most parts of the world there would be big resorts in that area, not farms. And nice contrast to the city, by the way. And the beaches were covered with boats, fishing boats. West Africa eats a lot of fish. In fact, we ate fish every single day that we were there, along with chicken. And this is some dried fish. I hope you can see, I hope it's clear enough to see. Dried fish is a favorite. We went to a market. We actually smelled it, decided that this might not be what we want to eat, but Africans love their dried fish. And the doctors that were with us really loved the dried fish. And then there are the water and the mangroves. And these areas are very important to the environment because they help keep the whole jungle environment, the whole system working and healthy. And then as we got up higher, we started to see the jungle that has been cleared, big patches of it, with fires are still burning. And there were vivid dirt road scars there. And people are planting plantations. They're gold mining in the jungles. They're trying to find ways of making money so that they can start to repair their country and get their infrastructure back in place. And I thought the trees were absolutely beautiful, flying over the jungles. But there were always these tiny little villages that just appeared. They were so isolated, and you kind of wonder how people managed living in that kind of isolation. And then we spotted the hospital, Jackson F. Doe Memorial Hospital, nestled in the jungle in the small community of Tapeta. And that's it with the red roof. And this would be our home for the next many days. We stayed at a guest house right back there that's on the hospital grounds. It's a campus where many of the hospital workers live. They live in those barrack-like houses, and they share their amenities and community eating areas. The garden that was my assignment is all of this area. It's a huge, big area. Nobody could tell me exactly how big, but it has to be at least 10 acres. So it was a little bit daunting just looking at it and trying to figure how we would deal with that. And then the view before we landed. And I just thought I would show you this. This is Tapeta. But there's always smoke. There's always fires burning. And you can always smell smoke in the air. And this is ultimately how garbage is burnt. So there's always that kind of chemical, plasticky kind of a smell in the air because they don't have any other way, it seems, of dealing with their garbage. Well, we landed in a field and we were met by dozens of excited and curious children. Some of us walked the 2 miles to the hospital because there wasn't any room in the truck that came to pick us up for us, all of us, and our gear. And so we had a really good look at the village as we walked through it. We had more people join us on our team. We had Harry, this fella here, and Mabel, a surgical nurse. Harry was a neurosurgeon, or is a neurosurgeon, and they came from Ghana. And then Momo, where is Momo? This fella here. He came from Nigeria, and he is an anesthetist. So people that were really essential to this trip. Because some record-breaking spinal surgeries were about to be performed in that hospital. The first ever spinal fusions in Liberia. And because of this, 4 people are now able to walk again. Some will even be able to go back to work. But not everyone that needed surgery received surgery. One man was so sick because he had a spinal infection that he couldn't actually have his surgery. It would have been too risky. The hospital runs on a generator. There aren't any electrical overhead. They don't have power lines the way we do. And so there isn't always enough fuel to keep the electricity on. And so sometimes some of the surgeries on that week had to be canceled because there wasn't enough fuel to run the generator, which ran the power that was needed for the surgeries. That's kind of the state of how things are in Liberia. You have to go with what happens. So these people have been rescheduled for May, and hopefully there will be enough fuel at that point. But one of my other jobs on this trip was to photograph various projects that team members were completing. So I had the opportunity to be part of a lot of interviews with the spinal patients. And all of them, this was the first spinal patient in Liberia, first fusion. His name is Tito. And they were all so thankful that help had come to them to relieve the pain that they were feeling, and so that they could walk again. This guy had been waiting since 2013 for surgery. It's a long wait, so it's amazing that they were still able to get him on his feet again. But I actually spent more time with this man, Richmond. And Richmond, too, had had a very serious back injury. A lot of people in Africa seem to fall out of coconut trees, or they have accidents on their very rough and crude roads, and so they get a lot of spinal injuries. Richmond was quite emotional through his interview. He really spoke deeply from his heart, and the depth of his faith and his gratitude were very deeply moving to me. I was then asked to stay with him as he had to wait for x-rays, and during this time we chatted. A couple of his friends were there. We had a really nice time of prayer together, and we blessed Richmond because he was very unwell. His surgery had had complications, and he needed a lot of blood fusions. And yet, he never wavered in his thankfulness or in his faith. I was able to snap a few photographs of him later on as he went into that x-ray for his x-rays. And this machine was significant because Corley Boo had sent this machine previously to this hospital. And it was nice to get a picture of it actually in use. But my major assignment was the garden. And I looked forward to meeting George. He was the hospital gardener, and to begin my assignment of learning about and planning a healing garden. So this is George. He's in one of the many papaya trees that he grows on the land. George grows all of his food, including pineapples, mangoes, vegetables, plantain, bananas, anything that he can get his hands on to grow, he grows. And he raises chickens. He loves his chickens. He's calling his chickens. I hope this gives you a better sense of who George is. He's got a really gentle nature about him, and he loves nature and he loves his animals. After meeting George and seeing the garden, I realized that God again was inviting me to walk in water, because every day the temperature was around 40 degrees. And I'm not used to 40 degrees. And how was I going to work in that kind of heat? How would I ever be able to even walk in that kind of heat? And the garden needed so much work. But my thoughts of what I came for began to give way to other thoughts, as I realized I first had to encourage George and minister to George, and then plan the garden with him. I gave him this t-shirt gift. It says, Gardener of the Galaxy. He was over the moon with this gift of this shirt. This was Paul's idea for me to bring it. It was actually Paul's shirt, but he loved his shirt and he wore it frequently when I was there. Well, we quickly became like old friends. And he poured out his life story as I listened and asked some questions, and then he started recording it on paper. He kept telling me he needed to tell his story, that he needed somebody to listen without judgment. It would help him heal from all that he had been through during the Civil War. As we got to know each other, he started introducing me as his mother. His friends all responded with delight, some even telling me how pleased they were that I had come to help George. I didn't realize the significance of being called mother until I met George's son, who isn't his son at all. His name is Alvin, but they're not related, but this is somebody that George has taken in and he mentors as a son and as an artist. Being brought into an African family this way is a sign of respect and acceptance. Every day we worked in the garden, and there were lots of things to do. The heat didn't affect me the way I thought it was. This is God working to help me deal with all of this heat. I took regular water breaks because you have to, but we clipped back and tidied up garbage that was dropped everywhere, rejuvenated old cassavas, and that's what's happening here. Cassavas are a staple food of Africa. The people eat those big roots. They mash them up and make flour out of them. They eat them as vegetables. They use them in a whole lot of different ways. And we started building the odd fence because we needed to block people from taking shortcuts and making their own paths throughout the garden. And I encouraged anyone who was around to come and help me, to pick up the garbage, to collect those dead leaves and remove these dead branches. And the kids responded with eagerness. I always had willing workers. Besides, they were really fascinated with my secateurs, or my garden pruners, because they had never seen such a tool before in their lives. It was dry season, so planting wasn't very practical, but I did bring cuttings from my garden, so we did put them in an old wheelbarrow we found. And George has lots of seeds thanks to the Surrey seed bank that he will plant when the weather becomes wetter, so the wet season will come sometime around May. And then these plants will be planted out in the garden. But I love being in this garden, park, as George calls it. We made future plans for the garden. An African heritage village became the theme. And this is the most recent sculpture that George completed for our arrival, so he made it especially for us Canadians that were coming. It is the shape of Africa itself. And he is a very talented artist. He sculptures all kinds of animals. There's a lion, there's a giraffe, there are zebras. They say either way in Africa. A new one is a donkey. And the list goes on and on. There must be 15, 20 of these different animals in the park. And he makes them out of concrete and whatever materials he can find just lying around. He also makes papier-mâché items. And these are small items that he does. And he uses wire, whatever wire he can find, and papier-mâché. He goes to the school and gets paper that they need to recycle. And he does it the same way many of his ancestors did generations ago. And eventually these will all be painted. Early on, he asked me if I would like to help him with his papier-mâché. I didn't realize it then, but through his friends, learned that this was an indication again of the respect George had for me. He trusted me. He didn't trust very many other people. Working with bare hands in concrete to repair and restore animals became a usual activity. And we had to repaint a lot of the animals as well. And we spent many hours in the hot sun painting. The paint would dry almost before we could get it off the brushes onto the animals. But we got the job done. We didn't finish. I think it'll be ongoing forever. His resources are very limited. He has hardly any tools. He had one broken rake. He had one shovel and a few cast-off paintbrushes. So he doesn't have a lot of tools to use with, but he has a wonderful imagination, and it's as vivid as is his joy for creating things. And everybody loves George's work, especially the kids, and they're always in the garden, they're always there on the animals. And everybody started to become really pleased to help out. This was a gorilla with its banana that I actually had the chore of painting again. And before I could get it painted, there were all kinds of kids that were around wanting to help out paint. And here we have the pastor Ernest and a youth worker that came, and they were quite thrilled to be able to help paint Africa. Now, as this got more and more painted, and it started, there's the gorilla and the kids painting it, by the way. And then as it got more and more painted, there's George. He doesn't have a ladder, so he puts tables on top of tables or boxes on top of boxes, and he puts a rope around the whole structure to keep himself from falling over. So not the ideal working conditions by any means. And so all these people kept coming, and as more of it was being finished, people came to see it and to take pictures. Word was spreading quickly. Now, nearly everybody in Africa has a cell phone, and cell phone plans are really cheap. So you can get a cell phone for about $40, your plan for under $25, depending how much you want on it. So here's Momo, our anesthetist. He's come and he's taking his own selfie picture there. And he was quite delighted with this structure. The kids all wanted their picture taken too. They wanted to be part of the action. I think you might have seen this picture before, but I'm not sure. And the kids loved to paint. And I really encouraged George to let them help so that they would start learning how to take ownership of the garden and to protect it. Unfortunately, there was always some vandalism going on. But I thought if people would take ownership of something precious as this garden is, then this garden will start to develop at a much faster rate. I loved the many people that passed through every single day in this garden. Sometimes it was the guards who work at the entrance of the hospital property. There were a lot of mums that did a lot of laundry. I couldn't believe how much laundry they do. Kids playing in the mango tree. The kids were full of joy. They were always out there having fun, wandering around where they felt like it, and so forth. And sometimes it was kids on their way to school. Kids in Liberia, in Tapeta, they go to school for half a day every day of the week. They don't go for full days, so the kids come through in shifts. And then there were people that came to sit on the many benches that George has made, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. And then there would be ladies coming through selling their bananas or their pineapples or papayas or whatever to people in the compound. These bananas were probably 25 pounds. They're really quite heavy to put on the top of your head and to walk around with that. And they do this all day long, trying to raise a few dollars so that they can feed their kids. But every day people would come by and thank me for being there and working. I was quite surprised by this, but every day people would come up to me and say, thank you, thank you. And as the garden became more welcoming, more gratitude was expressed. And I thought this was really a great thing to see, that people really cared about this garden and gave me a lot of encouragement. I loved what God was showing me. He was showing me how joyful people with so little can be, how free the kids are to wander and play without fear of strangers, how beautiful the jungle is, the magnificent trees. Now, George was really delighted that I was really thrilled every time I found a really colorful and unique insect. And we took breaks so that I could photograph them and stop. And so sometimes we had quite long coffee breaks taking pictures of grasshoppers. They're incredibly beautiful and colorful. And this is the one that the kids told me tasted the best. And I wasn't going to try that out because I was going to stay with the fish and the chicken legs. So I didn't try that one. But here's another grasshopper, how big and how varied they are. And this one, of course, too, is used for food. So because I love these insects, George set out to find me more interesting things, and we found nests of the weirdest spiders I've ever seen in my life. I didn't take pictures of them. And praying mantis. Praying mantis in Liberia are huge, really huge, and very strange insects. And they move in such choreographed almost motions, but they're very fascinating, and they are a gardener's friend because they eat a large amount of garden pests. So they're things that you want to have there. Well, George searched for scorpions to show me. He said they're everywhere, but we never did find one. I think that was God protecting me again. So there were lots of things we didn't see. I didn't have to drink poison, and I didn't see any snakes, so I was quite thrilled with that. But one day my arms got quite scratched from plants, and they were totally covered with stinging red spots from the ants. And there were red ants everywhere. Somebody pointed out that this one was hanging over my head as I was working in the garden. I tried to avoid them, but really it was impossible every day. And that night, after I got all these stings, before I went to bed, I put some salve on my arms to ease the sting, because I know that fire ant bites can easily get inflamed. I've had experience with them before, and I know it takes a really long time to heal from them. And when I was talking with God that night before I fell asleep, I actually reminded him of his promise when Jesus was sent out the disciples to teach the Gospels. Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. And I like that, all creation, because that includes all creation, not just people creation, but all creation. And so I love that that is in that verse. And these signs will accompany those who believe. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. Well, I fell asleep that night believing that no harm would come to me. In the morning I awoke. My arms were completely free of both scratches and ant bites. And I thank Peter, who reminded me of this verse before I left for Africa. And many times I thought of this verse and the prayers of my home group in Langley, and all the prayers that had been prayed over me for protection and safety. Repeating it gave me confidence to know that I had nothing to fear, ever. I was never alone. I know that God was always with me. God's Spirit protected me from poison and from snakes. And He is always faithful to us through His promises. I was very aware of the prayers from home church and my family, some of who are sitting back there, and friends, and even other churches. These kinds of prayers are really powerful, and I thank you, home church, for praying for me on my journey. Well, there was a day, and I was being harassed by 4 or 5 teenagers. Some of them may have been a little bit older, but they were determined they were going to get my water bottle, then my backpack, then my cell phone, and my camera. And they were really persistent. And I prayed that they would just move on and get out of the garden and leave me alone, but they didn't. So Sam, one of the guards down at the gate, this is him, this fellow right there, noticed them from the guardhouse, and so he came all the way up to the hill where I was working, and told these boys, these men, to move on, to leave the garden. They were very disrespectful to Sam. I was shocked at how disrespectful they were. But they did eventually leave. Sam told me they were criminals, but he didn't think they would come back. And so I looked for them every day, but I didn't see them again. But every morning after that, when I arrived to work in the garden, Sam would let me come by to let me know he was looking out for me. Again, God's protection and grace, even though I didn't actually know I needed it. I didn't know these guys would be harmful people or bad guys. Well, George's story says so much about life in Liberia. He came from a small Liberian jungle, one of 8 kids. His dad was a farmer. When George was 22, he joined the Liberian army with hopes to continue his education. A year later, controversy between 2 tribes resulted in a coup d'etat. George then was trained by U.S. Marines as a commando, so he was able to sidestep a lot of the terror that was happening in the country at that time, although he didn't ever tell me what terror he actually might have been involved in. Later on, there was another coup and even more terror. George stayed at his post, I think he was a staff sergeant at this point, until he was captured. He seemed to always land on the wrong side of these political groups. He was tortured, and thanks to his Marines training, he was able to escape, and then he was on the run. The citizens he was escaping with didn't want any army people with them, so they were driven away from this small group of people. George calls it a divine moment, because within 10 minutes, the people who drove him away were all executed by the rebels. George was found by a soldier who was actually hunting George. He asked if he was a Christian. That is, the other soldiers asked George if he were a Christian, and he said he was. So the soldier told him to flee quickly, or he too would be killed. God's hand and faithfulness to George seemed to be very evident through all these episodes. During the next coup d'etat, many people sought refuge in the Lutheran Church in Monrovia. George went there, filled out the displaced person's paperwork, but then he remembered to seek God's counsel about whether to stay. God convicted him immediately to leave and to go and hide elsewhere. This is hard to take, but the next day, 600 people were executed in that very church. And so God saw that as listening to God, keeping his ears tuned to God's voice, keeping his eyes on God. So during these 3 coups d'etat, civil war among 16 tribes, struggling to survive without food, George said he was actually living Psalm 23. He wasn't just reciting it, but he was living this in real life. And he wanted me to tell you people about how important that psalm was to him, because he felt like he was right in the middle of it. And it wasn't because so many people lost their lives, but because God saved his life from the hand of the wicked ones. George knows who his God is, and he knows that the kingdom within him is far greater than the kingdom of evil around him. Because he lives looking down from heaven to earth, he lives really powerfully, offensively, and peacefully. He lives with a really big God. He lives as a victor, and his ear is always listening to God. He does not live as a victim. He knows God has been faithful to him in all circumstances. George chooses to walk on water by faith and by trust. His story is filled with so many similar challenges, but eventually he sought refuge in Ivory Coast and began to live on the grounds of a church where he began to sculpt in earnest. There he and his artwork was discovered by Dr. Ketta. This is just a little bit more of his artwork. And Dr. Ketta brought him to the hospital in Tapeta to manage and develop the garden using his skills as an artist. He suffers greatly from PTSD, but his art and his gardening allow him to look beyond all of these hardships and to live in a place of joy. I think that is absolutely remarkable for everything that this man has been through. Liberian churches are lively, they're colorful, everybody gets dressed up, there's a lot of soul and a lot of emotion. They're quite noisy. Churches are packed with kids, and people are ready to sing their hearts out for Jesus. They are very generous givers in many, many ways, even though they have so very little. We also attended a brand new church in Monrovia. It's not finished yet. It's just the beginning of a church. But there were lots of people that came out to worship, and hopefully one day they'll have a better roof, and they'll have some windows, and they'll have many of the things that they actually would love to have here. And I kept thinking, by comparison, we at Home Church are actually really quiet, and our services are really quiet. But it's also really important to remember that we worship and praise the same God, and we're united as one by the same Spirit. Different ways of worshiping. I was really sad to leave Tapeta. I had become really attached to the place. So on the last day, I was on my way to breakfast, and I spotted a little girl racing across the field to me. And she just literally flew into my arms. She just wanted to say goodbye and give me a hug. Other kids were there too, asking for their hugs. These little ones are so precious, and this was a precious moment that I didn't realize was captured on Christina's cell. But Colossians 3:12 had taken on a very real significance at that moment, as I realized I wasn't the only one feeling sad that morning as we were saying goodbye. Clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And overall, put on love. Love and compassion, heart power. The Liberia I found is a hurting country, struggling to overcome the scars of Ebola and civil war. But I found the most important thing that I brought with me was my heart of love, knowing this, that I am only one, and yet I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something, and I will choose to do the something that I can do. It's all about making the choice. That is a quote from Helen Keller. Going to Africa was my something, my way of walking on water. It was my way of stepping out, listening to God in faith. There's a whole lot more I could tell you. There's a lot of stories that came out of this trip. There's a lot of pictures. I've only shown you a fraction of all the pictures that I took. But anyhow, I think I've probably used up my time. And so I'll end with saying shalom and amen.